What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over the top waiver ads heading into week 16. Congratulations to each one of you that has made it this far. This is championship weekend for most people. For that reason, this video is likely going to be a bit shorter than usual. We really only need to discuss the streaming options. There's really only 1 week we need to be concerned with either starting these players or not. So the analysis that does go into them is much more cut and dry. I personally am still in it in 2 of my 4 leagues. I was surprised when looking back at both of my rosters that I actually didn't have one single player on each team that I shared on both rosters. I'm really interested to hear from you guys on what player or players you would definitely thank for helping you get this far in the season. Me personally, to throw a few names out there, I'm thanking Stephon Diggs, David Montgomery, James Robinson, and Alvin Kamara. Those have definitely been the anchors across my 2 rosters. But like I said, we're interested to hear from you, so let us know in the comment section down below. And with that, let's get into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which top 20 fantasy tight end has the lowest average target distance. The correct answer was actually Jonnu Smith. Congratulations to Avery Brown. You got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which quarterback is leading the league in air yards per attempt? Once again, that's which QB is currently leading the league in air yards per attempt. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, we're moving over to the running backs and wide receivers, and like I had mentioned, there's really no need for us to go super in depth with their long-term value. There is only 2 weeks left in the entire season and usually 1 week for fantasy, so really we're going to focus on their matchup this upcoming week. At the top of the list though, we do have Tony Pollard. Pollard, as we know, is taking over for the injured Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott was a surprise addition to the inactive list last week because everything leading up to that game did signal that he was likely going to play. In his absence though, Tony Pollard completely popped off. While he didn't get a lot of volume on the ground, he was very efficient. 12 carries, 69 yards, even scoring on the ground twice. What was really promising to see was his work in the receiving game, 6 receptions for 63 yards. In this upcoming week, it's a matchup against Philadelphia, which I know Philadelphia is not the greatest matchup we could possibly ask for, but Tony Pollard definitely has the skill set to be able to beat this otherwise disappointing matchup. What is promising to know is that the Philadelphia Eagles have actually allowed a rushing touchdown to a running back in 11 of 13 games this season. So if Tony Pollard is the only available running back heading into this contest, there's a good chance he scores regardless of what he gets done on the ground. One thing to keep in mind though is that we don't know the health of Ezekiel Elliott. He was somewhat of a surprise inactive last week, indicating that they were expecting to have him available. I assume if they were expecting to have him available last week, that would go double for this week. And if Ezekiel Elliott is active, then Tony Pollard and his fantasy value would be completely diminished. So make sure you're watching the notes, staying up to date, so you know exactly how to value Tony Pollard for this upcoming week. Keep in mind, our website is completely free, which also houses our up-to-date waiver wire information, letting you know exactly how much fab or what priority we would spend on each of those players. So if there are any news and notes leading up to this upcoming Wednesday, we'll definitely have it updated on there. So if you're interested in checking that out, that's available at thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that in the description below. The next running back we have is LeVeon Bell of the Kansas City Chiefs. As we know, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he did also get injured. There were x-rays that were done that came back negative, but at this point, we're not sure exactly how long Edwards-Helaire will be out. With that type of news being available, that indicates to us that he won't be active for this upcoming Week 16 matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons matchup in particular is one we typically try to avoid because they are so beatable through the air that usually the running back doesn't get the volume or red zone opportunities we're typically looking for when starting a rusher against them. Regardless of matchup though, LeVeon Bell is still a starting running back on one of the best offenses in the entire league, which will garner a top 20 ranking, potentially higher. We'll have to see how exactly the rankings shape up, and considering I've seen him dropped in a ton of leagues over the past 2 weeks, he's now available in sub 60% of leagues. If you're getting a rusher on that type of offense that's available on waiver wire, you're gonna smash it. And moving into the final running back we have that we would suggest potentially picking up is going to be Salvon Ahmed of the Miami Dolphins. Ahmed has received 20 plus touches in each of the past 3 games. He also comes into this game with a matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, who have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to the running back position across the season. And for those of you wondering if maybe they've been trending upward at defending that position as of late, know it's still a phenomenal start for any running back lining up against them. So for a player who's been receiving 20 plus touches in each of the last 3 consecutive games, it's a smash spot. But that's going to do it for the running backs we would suggest taking off the waiver wire this week. Typically, we like to stick with the notion of start your studs. So most of these players, even though they're listed here, they didn't help you get there, so you likely do have better options available. Moving on to the wide receivers though, down below, we're going to start with Emmanuel Sanders, who's owned in 50% of leagues. If you guys may have been unaware, Michael Thomas has been placed on IR. That move is pretty surprising, but we did know he was still dealing with injuries that have plagued him all season long. And with Drew Brees now returning, a more competent passer than Taysom Hill, who had been the starter while Drew Brees was injured, and with that upgrade in the passing game, Emmanuel Sanders is likely going to be the favorite target for Brees. I'm not sitting here and telling you that starting Emmanuel Sanders this week isn't going to be risky, but if you're in a desperate situation, maybe you lost Michael Thomas, this could certainly be a viable replacement. Behind him, we have Rashard Higgins, who is only owned in 16% of leagues. I did catch some flack for not including him last week. It is true that heading into this week, he had received a combined 19 targets over the past 2 contests, scoring in both. And now in week 15, he followed that up with a decent performance, 4 receptions, 76 yards. That's double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. So he's proven now over a 3-game stretch that he's a main contributor in this offense. And heading into week 16, he gets a matchup against the Jets. The Jets on the season have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And while yes, they did play good against the Rams this past week, looking back just 2 weeks ago in week 13, this defense was completely torched by Russell Wilson and Seattle for 3 passing touchdowns. They actually allowed 53.6 fantasy points to go to the wide receiver position. Even if they allow 75% of that to Cleveland, the way that the target distribution has been working in this offense for the wide receiver position would mean that Rashard Higgins would have a really solid day. The last player to potentially add is going to be Lynn Bowden of the Miami Dolphins. He's coming off of a 6 reception performance, and considering you can start him at both wide receiver and running back, he does make a somewhat safe floor option that you can possibly get off of waivers. The upside is certainly questionable, but it is a matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. Like I had mentioned before, very beatable defense both through the air and on the ground. And while Lynn Bowden won't get a ton of rushes on the ground, his work in the receiving game should more than make up for it. Alright guys, we're moving over to the tight end streamers. I did select from the list of 60% ownership and below. At the top, we have Austin Hooper. He's currently owned in 50% of leagues, and I think you guys can start to notice a trend. I'm really high on the Cleveland players in this offense this upcoming week. The matchup against the Oakland Raiders is fruitful at almost every position all around, making Austin Hooper a pretty solid start this week, and he's owned in sub 60% of leagues. Austin Hooper is coming off of his best fantasy performance of his entire season, and we know the Raiders are coming off of a really down performance at guarding that position, allowing Hunter Henry to post his best fantasy day of the season with 5 receptions, 65 yards, and a touchdown on just 7 targets. If Austin Hooper can recreate any of that type of success, this would definitely be the matchup, so he leads this list. But behind him, we have Jared Cook of the New Orleans Saints. Jared Cook's ownership is a tad higher, coming in at 53%, but he's certainly a player who has found his way to waiver wires over the past few weeks. And with Drew Brees back, a potential upgrade in volume in the passing game, and with Michael Thomas being placed on IR, Jared Cook is stepping in and playing a major role for this offense. Cook is coming off of a disappointing performance against Kansas City with just 2 receptions for 29 yards. That may help him find his way to waivers this week, so if he is dropped, consider picking him up and starting him this week. He has a matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, a team that definitely allows a lot of fantasy points to go around. So if there was a bounce back moment for Jared Cook potentially, week 16 would definitely be a possible week for that. Behind him, we have Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas in his performance this past week was certainly surprising, which means in most leagues, I feel like he is going to be a top waiver target for tight end needy owners. So if you're somebody who really wants to put your chips on Logan Thomas, you may have to invest a higher waiver priority or more fab in order to get him on your team. His ownership has already skyrocketed up to over 50%, and that was as of last week. If waivers waivers do clear this week, if there's any teams that do pick up tight ends, it's almost certain that his ownership is going to increase from here, because very few tight ends in the entire league are able to ever receive 15 plus targets, and Logan Thomas is coming off of a game in which he did receive that volume, converting 13 of them into receptions. In this upcoming week, week 16, he has a matchup against Carolina, a beatable matchup ranking top 5 for allowing fantasy points. Up next, we have Jordan Akins. If everybody in your league owns 2 to 3 tight ends and you really have no options, Jordan Akins is certainly a name you could throw out there. He's only owned in 3% of leagues and is coming off of back-to-back performances with 6 receiving targets. This upcoming week, he faces the Cincinnati Bengals, who have been a defense that we try to start our tight ends against no matter what. Almost every tight end does find success against this defense. We're talking 100 plus receiving yard upside, multi-TD upside, and while Jordan Akins doesn't really garner the same type of target market share to really make that a reality, a top 12 finish for Akins this week is certainly in his range of outcomes. The final tight end we have is Dalton Schultz of the Dallas Cowboys. This was a player I was a bit lower on last week because of the matchup against San Francisco. San Francisco heading into that matchup had allowed the least fantasy points to the position, but Dalton Schultz showed his ability to overcome that. Heading into this week, he doesn't have a phenomenal matchup either, but it's miles and yards greater than his matchup last week. So for a player who was able to overcome that matchup, who's only owned in 29% of leagues coming into a softer matchup, he certainly makes a good option this week. The Dallas Cowboys will be facing the Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles have allowed 2 receiving touchdowns to tight ends over the past 3 contests. Alright guys, we're moving over to quarterbacks, and to start this list, of course, we have Jalen Hurts, who completely popped off against the Arizona Cardinals. Me personally, I am not a fan at taking risks when starting rookie quarterbacks, especially in their first few games, because the odds of them underperforming are very high because we don't know exactly what we're getting with that player. Seeing Jalen Hurts, though, overcome that post his best fantasy day against the strongest defense since he's been a full-time starter, that was very promising to see, and the work that he's been getting done on the ground with his legs do give me the confidence in telling you he has a safe floor. For that reason, I think the 31% owned Jalen Hurts should be on everybody's radar, even if you don't need a quarterback to start. If your opponent does, grab him off of waivers, because you definitely wouldn't want to lose to somebody picking up Jalen Hurts off of the waiver wire and starting him against you. Behind him, we have Baker Mayfield, who has had 2 of his best fantasy performances over the past 2 consecutive weeks. He's also coming into a matchup against the New York Jets, who have already been very vocal about liking the other pieces around him, a la Rashard Higgins, Austin Hooper, and if I'm really liking those pieces this week, you definitely have to know I'm liking Baker Mayfield as well. Mayfield is only owned in 27% of leagues, so he's definitely a player you can get out there. And with the New York Jets allowing the second most fantasy points to the position, the odds of Baker Mayfield continuing his trend of success is very likely. Up next, we have Mitchell Trubisky of the Chicago Bears. He is coming off of a down performance, but that is in no way indicative of how strong or weak this offense is. And Mitchell Trubisky, despite having 2 somewhat disappointing performances for fantasy, has had no issue getting his team into scoring range. It hasn't really worked out for him though. David Montgomery has been vulturing a lot of the touchdowns that would typically go to Trubisky, but heading into this week, there is a ton of upside. The Chicago Bears have been a 30 plus scoring offense machine. Trubisky this week will be facing the Jacksonville Jaguars. As we know, they allowed Lamar Jackson to have a vintage 2019 type performance against them, so Mitchell Trubisky, while he won't bring that type of upside to the table, he'll be close, if not a top 15 option this week. The final quarterback we have is Jared Goff, and I can understand why some of you may not trust him. He really let us down in a smash spot against the New York Jets, but in fantasy football, we do have to have short-term memories because outliers do happen. Heading into that matchup, the LA Rams were supposed to completely plow through the New York Jets defense. They were over 2 touchdown favorites in that game, expecting to score most of the points, but with Goff's down performance does mean he likely will find himself to waivers, even more so than he already has. Right now, he's owned in about 50% of leagues. I would expect that ownership to drop, and considering this week he has a road tilt against the Seattle Seahawks, a defense that is likely going to force the LA Rams into a pass-heavy situation, the upside and potential for Goff to have a bounce-back game is really high this week. Alright guys, we're moving over to the streaming defenses of week 16, and all of these defenses have a very low ownership, so a lot of these are available out there. To start this list, we have the Houston Texans defense, which has been a bottom 5 performer, but they have a top 5 matchup this week. This upcoming week, they face the Cincinnati Bengals, who will be starting either one one of Brandon Allen or Ryan Finley. Both are quarterbacks you want to target when starting your defense against them. So even though the Houston Texans have been an underperformer all season long, this is certainly a matchup where you can milk some value out of it. Behind them, you have the LA Chargers defense, another underperforming defense on the season, but they come into this week with a very solid matchup as well, coming in against the Denver Broncos, who have been allowing the 5th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Drew Lock, he's also coming off of a really down game. He didn't have a lot of turnovers, but anyone watching that game knew that the defense had it under control the entire time. So the LA Chargers coming into this one, while they have been a bottom half defense for fantasy across the season, they certainly bring in a ton of upside in this matchup. Behind them, you have the Arizona Cardinals defense, owned in just over 30% of leagues. Despite playing the Philadelphia Eagles last week and allowing Jalen Hurts to have a very solid performance, they still actually were able to compile 7 fantasy points on defense, which is very respectable. They will have an actual softer matchup this week facing Nick Mullins and the San Francisco 49ers. This has been a defense that has feasted on younger or inexperienced quarterbacks all season long, with some of their best performances coming against the New York Giants and the Dak Prescott-less Dallas Cowboys. A solid one, like I had mentioned, against Jalen Hurts and the Eagles. So heading into this one, it should be a cakewalk for them. Behind the Cardinals, we have the Philadelphia Eagles, who, despite having some offensive issues, are surprisingly ranked inside the top 12 for fantasy defenses. Their inconsistencies, though, are a large part as to why they're owned in only 22.5% of leagues. I will say, however, this upcoming matchup against the Dallas Cowboys is certainly one that they can exploit. Jalen Hurts and his ability to push the ball down the field could open up more opportunities for mistakes in this Cowboys offense. The Cowboys offense, while it did look good against the San Francisco 49ers defense last week, we have a larger sample size of showing them struggling against much worse defenses, and the Philadelphia Eagles are pretty underrated. The final defense we have is in the same matchup. It's the Dallas Cowboys defense. They are going to, of course, face the Philadelphia Eagles. What's notable about the Cowboys defense is that they're coming off of their 2 best performances in each of the past 2 weeks, and Jalen Hurts, while he was able to, for the most part, pick apart the Arizona Cardinals pass defense, we still have to be mindful that the Arizona Cardinals fantasy defense was able to still put up 8 fantasy points against Jalen Hurts. So the Dallas Cowboys, who have been heating up at the right time, certainly have a chance to do that and repeat that success in this matchup for week 16. So for that, they should definitely be a defense in your consideration. They're only owned in 15% of leagues, so if you do need to go bargain bin shopping, Dallas Cowboys could certainly be your team. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.